Hey neighbor, thanks for dropping in for another dose of my weekly countdown show 7 on Sunday. Today's topic involves musical groups that did what most who split up simply couldn't. They broke up, they went their separate ways, and they never got back together. Time zips by like a cheetah, so while some have chosen to put their differences aside and hit the road again, or maybe even record some new music, these 7 put it on ice and let it slowly melt away, leaving behind a legacy that we the fans have to carry on since they're no longer the faces promoting it. I decided to set a requirement for this list since a lot of bands tend to break up only to reverse the decision within a decade. For example, My Chemical Romance, Anne Berlin, Motion City Soundtrack. These are all bands that broke up and reunited during the 2010s, so with the 10 in mind, every band on this list has to have been broken up for at least 10 years in order to qualify. Also, this should go without saying, but none of the bands on the list are here because of the death of a member. These have to be natural splits that occurred for some other reason other than that. Allow me to rip off the band-aid, no matter how much that reminder might hurt, so while you're recovering, sit back, hit that like button and cry, because the odds are stacked against permanent reunions for everyone you're about to see. There was always the feeling of suspense when it came to the garage rock revivalists, the White Stripes. Were they siblings, married, divorced, something else, and was this a sustainable tightrope act they could maintain well into the future? Unfortunately, we know the answer to that final question given their official breakup announcement back in February 2011. That was a painful day for me as a longtime fan. It was just right into the heart, they're never gonna be a thing again. The White Stripes were one of the first bands that ever really made me feel intensely about music. And not just me, they tore down walls for millions of fans who were able to appreciate their non-linear way of thinking that always felt like it couldn't have come from anyone else other than Jack or Meg. Meg White wrestled with the beast known as anxiety behind the scenes, quickly adopting a less stressful lifestyle after finishing up the tour dates in support of what would become their final album, Icky Thump. In no way do I blame Meg for this decision, and I really don't think Jack did either. There was almost a 4-year gap between their final proper show in July 2007 and the breakup reveal in 2011, so to me that proves they didn't make this decision hastily. Those reverse Uno cards I talked about in the intro, the bands who break up only to get right back together within a few years, sometimes that's the result of not even really trying to talk it out or seeing if feelings change in a month, a year, or even 2. Why break up if you're not 110% positive? The Stripes' split after a decade together is now at an odd fork in the road because their time together is practically outweighed by their time apart. The former bandmates rarely speak, according to Jack himself, since Meg obviously hasn't at all been in the spotlight. He's bounced back and forth on how he feels about being a solo artist versus being the driving force behind the White Stripes, and of course he has his other bands too, but it feels like things came to a natural end the closer you look, so let's just be grateful they didn't force what wasn't there. On the get back together-o-meter, I'd put a solid stack of cash on the White Stripes, clocking a 1 out of 10, with 1 being the absolute lowest of chances for a full-on reunion with touring, new music, and all that good stuff. Their artistry alongside the rotating red, black, and white aesthetic they never dropped their entire time together as a band was an entire movement by itself, so as long as we keep passing the magic along, the White Stripes are never gonna die.
I was struck by lightning, walking down the street. I was hit by something last night in my sleep.
Oingo Boingo were a band that directly spoke to the weird latchkey kids of the 80s, the ones with a heart full of gold probably and a love for the general nerdery that wouldn't be so widely accepted until decades later. You've heard the name Danny Elfman before, right? Famous film composer, Nightmare Before Christmas, Mission Impossible, Spider-Man, Corpse Bride, any of those setting off a light bulb in your head? Yeah, that's the guy, Danny Elfman, a man who just so happened to also be the leader of this new wave ska rock band of misfits. From their humble beginnings as a theater troupe throughout the 1970s, the Mystic Knights of Oingo Boingo dropped the front half of their name and reached a pretty dedicated level of support by the time they put out their magnum opus Dead Man's Party in 1985. Elfman was the engineer of the Boingo ship Always. So when it started to lose steam in the late 80s until their lingering question mark of a final release in 1995, It's almost like he had an epiphany that film scores were his future and Oingo Boingo was destined to become a relic of the past. The entire band pulled together an epic finale of a concert for Halloween 1995 that pulled out all the stops, new and old hits, costumes, the eccentric showmanship. Everything was there, including Danny Elfman in his t-shirts, sandals, and shorts, looking like he just walked on stage after a peaceful day at the beach. To give fans that sense of closure, one that truly felt like the ending to something that meant the world to so many people, I have to respect that move 110%. Since that final goodbye, many of the members have remained friends and have even worked together, including Danny Elfman and longtime guitarist Steve Bartek. They've never fully reunited for anything, and in 2021, Elfman permanently shut down the rumors of a reunion. He told Inverse magazine, "There's not going to be an Oingo Boingo reunion. Orchestras are simply not that loud. Being on stage, I was getting used to in-ear monitors. That's the big change in my life, being able to stand in front of the drums and not kill my hearing." With that confirmation from the ringleader himself, I'd put OB at a firm 0 on the meter. While it's obviously super exhilarating to see a great band come back from beyond the grave, there's something even more beautiful about one that did it right and felt content to let it rest in peace.
I am the jigsaw man. I turn the world around with a skeleton hands there. I am electric, hey, cannibal core, till I'm out there.
Several people have told me that they had absolutely no idea White Zombie wasn't just another alter ego for Rob Zombie, so with that in mind, let's talk about the permanent end of Rob Zombie's first band, White Zombie. Rob went on to become much bigger than White Zombie ever were, both as a solo artist and as a director, so don't beat yourself up if you didn't know. White Zombie was founded as more of a noise rock band in the mid-80s before growing into that heavy metal soundscape that bridged the gap between Mad Max and that dimly lit section of Spencer all the way in the back. Even though they didn't have an overnight success story, years of swapping out members and playing tons of shows paid off by the time they got a major label deal in the early 90s. Beavis and Butthead were roasting their music videos, MTV was playing them all the time, and those who really hated the grunge movement started to champion groups like White Zombie, a band who clearly gave 0 fucks, as evidenced by their album names and the song titles, and the fact that they would cleverly tuck in as many audio samples from movies as humanly than human possible. As their success grew, infighting caused further rifts between the remaining members, as the 90s rolled along like a road full of spike strips, and I'm sure it didn't help that Sean Easalt, the founding bassist of White Zombie, ended her longtime relationship with Rob sometime in late 1994. White Zombie haven't done much of anything since telling the world they were done in 1998. I mean, they did put out a box set 10 years later, but I hesitate to even say they since it was very much a Rob Zombie effort. Sean claims it was done despite her and guitarist Jay, which I do not doubt at all. Rob Zombie's first few solo albums basically just cloned the White Zombie formula, with different members filling their shoes, so all around, I don't know, I've just never really been a fan of the guy. Your breakup forecast is looking pretty grim, folks. I'm putting the chances at a Rob Zombie's Halloween 3 getting greenlit is more likely than a White Zombie reunion, which roughly translates to a 0 out of 10. None of the members seem willing, and at this point, if it did happen, you know it had to be for the paycheck of a lifetime. Not including the Smiths in a conversation about bands that defined the 80s is like swimming in a pool with no water. You don't do that, but you pull yourself up off the concrete because Strange Ways, here we come indeed. You've probably heard their name tossed around with other classic groups, ones that lasted for a long time, or maybe they're even still together, but don't forget the Smiths were only a thing for 5 years, literally only a half decade of activity, with an album a year from 84 to 87, and then boom, the vault was sealed forever. And by the vault was sealed, I mean the band never got back together. The actual vault holding their masters and demos was milked dry over the following decades, with re-releases galore stabilizing their popularity, despite the fact that the Smiths were no longer together. Morrissey is an insufferable prick, and apparently always has been, so if you're wondering why the Smiths broke up at the height of their fame, well, him being a dick might not have actually been the biggest reason for the split. You see, this was a band that were consistently spawning out hit singles, topping the album charts, selling out tours. They were on top of the world. but there was a growing credit and wage gap between the members that were not named Morrissey or Johnny Marr. Not only that, but Morrissey's increasingly volatile media presence alongside Marr not wanting to continue the band, and drugs or alcohol consuming everyone except their frontman, it turns out that those are actually not the key ingredients for stability. The Smiths entered into a self-inflicted downward spiral that tore them apart at the seams. They even lost the respect of many of their fans in the end, as they shed their indie status by selling out and signing to a major label deal for their final album in 1987, and then just throwing in the towel after Marr and Morrissey couldn't settle their numerous disagreements over everything and anything. Despite all of that, on the metered ranking, I'm gonna give the Smiths a solid 3 out of 10. It might not be a full-blown reunion given some of those awkward lawsuits between members, but the fact that their two leaders have entertained the idea multiple times and have even turned down huge paydays to headline a few shows because the timing wasn't right, it feels like something that would happen if you just made a wish on a Ouija board in a graveyard rather than a stars aligning type of magic. Should I have put them at number 1? Maybe, but honestly that would have been too predictable, so instead I'm putting everyone's favorite band of blockhead brothers at number 3. Oasis formed in the early 1990s and went on to define the better half of the decade with their unique fusion of Britpop meets alternative rock, a style they rolled with for a trio of albums before moving on to a slightly more experimental style that didn't really resonate as much, at least not on the level of something like Be Here Now or Morning Glory. As much as I enjoy even their final record, Dig Out Your Soul, I'm glad it ended there on a high note, because what happened after that album dropped got really ugly really fast. Liam and Noel Gallagher hating each other is just something you come out of the womb understanding. Like, I get it, Mom, I get it, Dad, we know Liam and Noel, they're gonna go back and forth, they're gonna trade insults, especially if you live in the UK, you know what I'm talking about. Even when they were together as bandmates, they would throw shade at each other in interviews, and now they do the exact same thing in the modern day, except sometimes they do it on social media. You'd have to be insane to expect an Oasis reunion at this point. You know they've turned down hundreds of millions of dollars multiple times for the simple fact that Liam and Noel would just get up on stage and straight up murder the shit out of each other. Like Roman Coliseum style, two brothers turned gladiators just pissed off that the other's solo record sold more copies than the other. It's hilarious though, and I do love their feuding. There's truly nothing else like it, like their pure sarcastic hatred of the other, despite the occasional claims that it's all love. Going with a firm 0 on the breakup meter. Crazier things have happened, but what happens when the two brothers outweigh those crazier things with their own cauldron of insanity? I don't know, I really can't answer that question. I just feel bad for the other 3 musicians having to rotate their time back and forth between the high-flying birds and Beady Eye, and I think I'm just gonna leave you with an extra little salt in the wound. Noel's better in every way and his solo stuff looks to Godzilla next to Liam. Bye. A decade of underground stardom in the 80s led to one of the most underrated punk bands of all time. That's the oversimplified story of Hüsker Dü, a powerhouse trio that inspired new generations of musicians, including some absolutely massive names like Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins, Pixies, and even Green Day. The Dü were often praised as being one of the first bands to truly bridge the gap between the hardcore punk scene and something more melodic. Bob Mould and Grant Hart wrote songs in a way that I can't describe as anything less than legendary. They had off-the-charts chemistry, and the music they made together under the name Hüsker Dü has aged like a fine wine, just waiting for you to discover it. While they would eventually meet a rather sad, rapid ending that could have never been predicted from a mile away, the years they spent together were pretty fucking stellar. If you didn't love the sound of one record like New Day Rising, chances are that you could cue up something like Candy Apple Grey and slowly dip your toes into the water of their addicting sound and find out, hey, if I love this one, maybe I'll give that other album another spin. Hüsker Dü were a band I've fallen in love with in recent years, thanks in part to my buddy Crash Thompson's recommendation. I am on the hook big time. I just can't get enough of their off-the-rails adventures. The storytelling can range from very immersive for a concept record like Zen Arcade, but sometimes they keep it light and punchy too. The overall music atmospheres can range from intense lightning-fast punk and post-hardcore to toe-tapping alt-rock that sounds way ahead of its time for a band that are from the 80s. No, they're not from the 90s, they just happened to pave the way. There were certainly a few red flags over the years, nothing major other than some unfortunate substance abuse issues, but everything changed when their longtime manager and close friend David Savoy died by suicide in early 1987, less than a month after the release of what would be their final album, Warehouse. It was a really tragic time that left Hüsker Dü in a state of shock, choosing to push ahead with the tour instead of taking proper time off to grieve. That move ended up exposing a lot of internal strife, and it gave credence to the fact that each member of the band was pulling in different directions. Bass player Greg Norton was a new father, Bob Mould's alcohol addiction resurfaced, and worst of all, drummer-songwriter Grant Hart was battling a nasty heroin addiction that put the final nail in the coffin for their future. Rest in peace to both Grant Hart, who passed away in 2017 due to liver cancer, and their manager David Savoy. I can't even imagine the toll that took, and I understand why Hüsker Dü remained a thing of the past. They were lightning in a bottle, creative visionaries really, but lightning rarely strikes twice in the same place, so their decision to move away from the band is completely justified. Permanent 0 out of 10 on the breakup meter, given that Grant's death made it impossible even if they had wanted to, but if I could leave you with one positive thing, then please check out Hüsker Dü if you're into punk rock, alternative music, or even post-hardcore. It's genuinely fascinating to see where a lot of our more modern mainstays got their influences, and the Dü, alongside other acts like Refused, are a great place to start.
Run, 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 run away. Oh, run, psycho killer, just to sin.
For the gigantic impact on music that you never have to look too far to hear or see, Talking Heads are my #1 pick for bands that broke up and never reunited. Now I know what you're thinking, didn't they technically get back together for their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2002? Yeah, but 4 people standing on a stage together doesn't make a band. David Byrne has made it unbelievably clear that Talking Heads are permanently defunct, so a one-off mini-set for an award doesn't keep them off this list. Talking Heads established time and time again that while they were a defining band of the New Wave era, New Wave couldn't pigeonhole them into not trying new things almost constantly. They were art punk risk-takers with a musical genius at the wheel, combining talents for an irreplaceable one-in-a-million sound that cemented their name worldwide. David Byrne made his stances clear, poetic, and pronounced with the help of the other heads, who often don't get enough credit, reining in multiple classics from the all-time innovator Remain in Light, that's probably my personal favorite, to other melting pots like Speaking in Tongues or Fear of Music or even Talking Heads 77. Something rather curious happened after their popularity surge around the early 80s though. Instead of immediately building on that huge crescendo, they instead went on hiatus and didn't release anything new until 1983. But who knows, right? Maybe they were just trying to preserve their energy, maybe they knew that the bandmates needed time apart to heal, they wanted to focus on their solo projects. They let a few years pass, but they then reunited with an album nearly every year from 83 to 88, with their final LP Naked dropping in March of that year. One major criticism of the Talking Heads that stands out as true for me is the overall pretentiousness David Byrne often exudes. He's gifted and very well aware of it, so I couldn't imagine working with him for long periods of time as the smoothest wave you could ride. He hated doing the live shows, they couldn't tour, the ideas in his head were often hard to translate to tape. You could pick with any of those and run with it because they all led to the eventual downfall of the Talking Heads. After another extended multi-year hiatus following Naked, Byrne finally revealed to the LA Times in December 1991, the same month I was born, love that for me, that the Talking Heads had broken up, or call it whatever you like, which is probably the most David Byrne explanation ever, so it does check out. The rest of the band had long felt like useless playthings to David, so it's not like they didn't see it coming. Everyone was already involved in recording solo music or offshoots involving various other members of the band, including the Heads project in the mid-90s. Frankly, I don't ever see a real reunion of any kind happening ever, so I'm gonna end the list with a bleak prediction of a 1 out of 10 for the chances the Talking Heads will ever reunite. At least it is a 1 instead of a 0. Everyone's still alive that were the primary members of the band, so who knows? Maybe the Psycho Killer will strike again. Your support of this series 7 on Sunday never goes unnoticed, so thank you every time for hitting the like button, for leaving a comment with your thoughts on these episodes, and for subscribing to the channel in the first place. These episodes do require a lot of research, a lot of listening, but they're worth it in the long run since you guys seem to love them so much, so again, thank you. If you want to see a couple of recent ones, they're on screen now. All of my socials are in the description, and I'll be back soon for more on ARTV.